You're wearing that to your wedding? Pathetic. That was the text. 5 words from a number I hadn't seen in 20 years, but I knew exactly who it was. My father, retired Colonel Raymond Keene, former 101st Airborne, and the man who never forgave me for becoming a Navy officer. It came just minutes before I was supposed to walk through the chapel doors, dressed in my white admiral's uniform, rows of ribbons on my chest, 4 stars on my shoulders. On the other side, 180 Navy SEALs waited, and so did the man I was about to marry. My father wasn't there. At least, I thought he wasn't. But days later, a single photograph proved me wrong and revealed a truth I never expected. I was born at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, not in a hospital room with pastel walls and lullabies playing in the background, but in a place where the air smelled like motor oil and concrete, where the sound of boots hitting pavement was the daily rhythm of life. My earliest memories are of morning formation echoing down the block, the metallic clang of flagpoles in the wind, and the ever-present shadow of my father, Colonel Raymond Keene. In our house, the walls held more medals than family photos. My father believed the military wasn't just a career, it was bloodline. And in his mind, that bloodline flowed only through the men in the family. He used to say, "A uniform is a man's duty, not a woman's distraction." At 5 years old, I didn't understand. At 15, I understood too well. I both admired and feared him, admired the way people stood straighter when he walked into a room, feared the silence he could summon with just one look. He was a man of precision, meals at 1800 sharp, shoes lined at perfect 45-degree angles, television off by 2100. Even laughter felt rationed. My mother, Emily, was the opposite. She was a high school literature teacher with a voice like a soft hymn and a closet full of flowy cardigans. She would call me Wild Falcon when my father wasn't listening, a name that made me feel untamable, even in a world built on rules. She was the one who read me Emily Dickinson at bedtime, who told me that strength wasn't always loud, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply keep going. I grew up watching other kids ride bikes down the street while I was polishing my father's dress shoes until I could see my reflection. Summers didn't mean pool parties. They meant running errands on base, standing silently while my father spoke with other officers, learning how to press a crease into a pair of trousers so sharp it could cut paper. When I was 16, I started looking at my life with a sharper lens. I realized I didn't just want to exist in the shadow of a soldier. I wanted to be one. Not in his way, but in my own. And in my mind, the Navy was the branch that called to me. Discipline, yes, but also the ocean, movement, strategy. The decision wasn't spontaneous. I had been researching the U.S. Naval Academy for 2 years in secret, reading every brochure, watching every documentary I could find. I memorized the admissions requirements and started training before dawn, running the base track until my lungs burned. At 17, I mailed in my application. I didn't tell my father. My mother knew, of course. She helped me gather my transcripts and write my essays, slipping encouraging notes into the manila folders I kept under my bed. When the acceptance letter arrived, I remember standing in the kitchen holding it like it was a fragile artifact. My hands shook. My mother's eyes filled with tears, proud tears. My father walked in from the garage still wearing his service cap. I held out the letter to him like an offering. He read it in silence, his jaw tightening with each line. Then, without looking up, he said, "Ridiculous. Don't break the family tradition." That was it. No congratulations. No acknowledgement of the work I'd put in. Just a dismissal so clean and final it might as well have been an order. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. Not rebellion exactly, more like resolve. If my father wouldn't see me as worthy in his uniform, then I'd earn my own. And I would make sure that one day, when I walked into a room, people would stand. Not because of my last name, but because of what I had done. Silence has a sound. It hums in the corners of a house after an argument. It settles on the shoulders like a rucksack you didn't ask to carry. When I left for Annapolis, my father didn't shout, didn't slam a door. He simply turned down the volume on me until I could barely hear myself. Calls went unanswered. Letters came back unopened. It was as if he'd folded me into a file marked non-compliant and stored me somewhere he'd never have to look. My mother tried to fill the gap with gentleness. Sunday evenings, she would call from the kitchen, the clink of a teacup in the background, reading me a few lines she loved from Dickinson or Whitman, then asking about drill, about roommates, about the color of the sky over the yard that day. She never told me to come home. She told me to keep going. "Wild Falcon," she'd say softly. The wind is fierce, but so are you. In my second year, the calls grew shorter, not because we ran out of things to say, but because sickness trims the edges off a life without asking. She was diagnosed in the spring. By fall, her scarves had become permanent. We didn't talk about pain. We talked about tension on a line, how much it can bear before it snaps, and the way sunlight looks different when you know something you love is fading. I finished finals in a blur, caught a flight home, and walked into a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and lemon polish. My father was a statue in the corner, arms crossed, jaw locked. My mother, weightless under cotton sheets, reached for my hand and whispered, "Keep flying." Before dawn, she was gone. Grief doesn't arrive like a storm, it seeps. After the funeral, I waited for words from my father, anything, even anger. Instead, an email appeared in my inbox. 3 sentences. "The service was fine. I hope the Navy is treating you well. I still don't understand your decision." That was the eulogy for our relationship. Tidy, distant, final. So I did the only thing that made sense. I gave the silence a job to do. I let it discipline me. I ran before sunrise, lifted until my hands blistered, studied until the numbers blurred, learned to speak in the calm voice that makes other people breathe easier. When I pinned on ensign, I mailed my father a photograph. No response. When I boarded a plane to Yokosuka for my first assignment, I stared out the oval window at the Pacific and promised myself I'd leave every place better than I found it, even if the place was me. Yokosuka was not glamorous. Paperwork, logistics, making sure supplies arrived where they should, when they should, and that grown men who'd seen combat still respected a chain of command that included a woman half their size. I learned to listen more than I spoke. I learned the names of wives and kids back home, the bad knees, the quiet jokes, the trigger words that meant a sailor wasn't having a regular bad day, but the kind you sit with and wait out. I didn't chase rank, I chased competence. After 5 years Bahrain, hotter air, sharper edges, the work got heavier, my voice got steadier. Respect didn't come with the billet. I earned it one solved problem at a time. Then Somalia. We don't tell war stories to impress. We tell them to explain the dents in our armor. A recon run went sideways, an ambush in a yard of rusted shipping containers. 2 wounded, 1 trapped. I wasn't required to go forward. I went anyway. The air bucked with noise. Metal screamed when the rounds hit. A sailor's leg was shredded below the knee. I dragged him 30, then 40 yards, laid a tourniquet with one hand, and kept pressure with the other while barking coordinates into the radio that cut in and out like a stubborn engine. By the time the bird lifted, my uniform was soaked through and shrapnel stung hot along my ribs. I waved off the stretcher. I walked. They called me Ice Falcon after that, as if composure were the absence of fear and not the decision to stand still inside it. I didn't care about the name. I cared that he lived. Years later, I got a Christmas card with a picture of a baby girl, Avery. Named for the officer who kept her dad, the note said. I kept that one. Pain is private work. I rehabbed quietly, counting the steps until the limp disappeared. When a report landed on my desk, I knew which lines mattered, which numbers lied. In Coronado later, when I had a say, I rewrote parts of training, added mental check-ins, recovery protocols, more eyes on the margins. Dropouts fell, injuries halved, no parade, just fewer folded flags. That was enough. All the while, I sent proof of a life to the place I came from. A photo at a promotion, a link to a ceremony, a note after a successful rotation. The replies never came. The silence kept its post, standing guard at the door of my childhood like a sentry with orders not to yield. People imagine anger is what hardens you. Sometimes it's the absence of sound. It teaches you to build your own echo. By the time I wore commander's bars, I stopped asking the question that had followed me since Fort Campbell, will he ever see me? I replaced it with one that didn't depend on him. Will I see everyone under my command? That question changed everything. It turned the weight on my shoulders from punishment into purpose. And so, when the next chapter began, when love showed up in a quiet voice with steady eyes, I didn't need permission to accept it. I had already learned how to stand in a room with silence and still belong to myself. Some people crash into your life like a storm. Matthew Carter arrived more like a steady tide, not demanding space but making more of it with every conversation. We met at a joint Department of Defense working group in D.C., a conference full of sharp suits, clipped sentences, and egos you could trip over. He was a civilian intelligence analyst, assigned to the cybersecurity task force I'd been overseeing. Our first conversation was an argument. He thought my reporting format was inefficient. I told him efficiency wasn't always about speed, sometimes it was about clarity. The next morning, he handed me a completely revised briefing, using my format word for word. "You were right," he said with a half smile that carried no trace of resentment. That was how I knew he was different. Matthew wasn't threatened by my rank, my uniform, or the fact that I could probably outshoot him in a skills test. He asked the kind of questions most people were too intimidated to ask. How do you teach calm in chaos? Or, what was it like the first time someone called you Admiral? He never romanticized the danger, but he didn't minimize it either. Over the next year, we crossed paths on and off duty, planning briefings, clashing on strategy, then splitting fries in a diner at midnight like old friends. There was no pretense with him, no sense that I had to soften my edges or shrink my shadow. He saw the steel and didn't flinch. He saw the tiredness behind it and didn't look away. The proposal happened on a rare free weekend. We were in Michigan, sitting on the edge of a weathered pier that jutted out into the lake. The water was still enough to catch the pale reflection of the moon, and our boots dangled over the side, just brushing the surface. He didn't kneel, didn't make a speech. He simply opened a small box, looked straight at me and said, "Let me serve beside you, wherever that means." I didn't cry, I didn't need to, I just said yes. When we talked about the wedding, neither of us wanted spectacle. Matthew didn't like the idea of 100 people watching us repeat words we already lived by. I didn't want lace and frills that would feel like a costume. So we settled on something that felt right. The Naval Chapel in Annapolis. Small, formal, honest. No bridesmaids, no best man, no choreographed dances, just us, the chaplain, and the people who had walked with me through fire. Matthew would wear a simple navy suit. I would wear my white full-dress uniform, not as a statement, but as the truest version of myself. I had worn it in war rooms, in strategy briefings, and under the crushing weight of loss. Wearing it that day wouldn't erase those moments. It would carry them forward into something new. My team caught wind of the plan. They weren't invited, not because I didn't want them there, but because I assumed they were scattered across the globe on deployments. They showed up anyway. SEALs I had trained, deployed with, pulled out of wreckage. Men who had stood beside me in the darkest places on Earth. They told me it was non-negotiable. They would not let me walk down that aisle alone. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, I found myself ironing my uniform with a kind of reverence I didn't expect. Running my hands over the gold buttons, the 4 stars, the ribbons, each one a story, a cost, a reminder. I wasn't wearing it to prove anything to my father or to anyone else. I was wearing it because it was the only thing I'd ever put on that felt like truth. Matthew understood. He always had. He once told me, "Most people love pieces of you. I love all of you, even the parts you try to carry alone." And so, when the day came, I wasn't walking into tradition. I was walking into a life we had built, one forged in honesty, respect, and the quiet knowledge that whatever storms came next, we'd stand through them together. 15 minutes before the ceremony, I was standing behind the closed doors of the Naval Chapel, the kind of quiet that feels almost ceremonial settling around me. On either side stood 2 of my oldest teammates, both retired now, both with more gray in their beards than I remembered, both men who had once followed me into places where the air was thick with smoke and the ground shook under our boots. One of them, Chief Petty Officer Aaron Hill, leaned in and murmured, "You walked us through hell. Let us walk you to something better." I managed a small nod, grateful that some promises don't need to be spoken to be kept. That's when my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it. The world could wait. But habit dies hard in the military. When something pings, you check it. The number wasn't saved in my phone, but I knew it instantly. My father. 5 words glared up at me. "You're wearing that to your wedding? Pathetic." No greeting, no congratulations, no acknowledgement of the years I'd spent carrying a uniform he had sworn I'd never be worthy of. Just that. A final little dagger, slid in under the door, designed to cut. If this had come 10 years earlier, it would have rattled me. If it had come 5 years earlier, it might have left a bruise. But now, it landed on armor that had been tempered by fire and silence. Shame only works if you agree with it, and I didn't anymore. I slid the phone into my pocket, smoothed the cuffs of my white gloves, and breathed in the scent of polished wood and old hymnals. Then the doors opened. The moment was as sharp and clear as a bell. 180 Navy SEALs rose to their feet in unison, not because protocol demanded it, but because they chose to. The sound of heels clicking, the echo of Admiral on deck bouncing off the chapel walls. It wasn't just respect for a rank. It was respect for a life lived in full measure, for battles fought and not always seen, for the kind of leadership you can't fake. As I walked, my boots struck the floor in perfect rhythm. On my left, Hill, the same man who once pulled me from the twisted metal of a downed helicopter in Kandahar. On my right, Senior Chief Miguel Torres, who lost a leg in Syria and still outran half the base during morning PT. They weren't supposed to be my escorts. They insisted. When I reached the front, I saw Matthew waiting. He wasn't crying. That wasn't his way. But his eyes shimmered with something steady and unshakable. Behind him stood the chaplain I'd served with overseas, his own uniform bearing rows of ribbons that told their own quiet story. I didn't look for my father. I didn't need to. In that moment, I knew exactly who my family was. The vows were simple. No theatrics, no lines stolen from movies. We promised to serve each other, to protect each other's peace as fiercely as we'd protect each other's lives. I told him, when orders come, we follow together. When they don't, we find purpose on our own terms. He promised never to ask me to dim, never to let me carry the weight alone. When the chaplain pronounced us husband and wife, there was no eruption of noise, just a stillness that felt almost sacred. Then the applause came, not rushed, not polite, but thunderous, earned, and honest. We walked out under an arch of crossed sabers, the blades gleaming in the spring light. It's a tradition usually reserved for officers, but this time, the men holding those blades were enlisted. That meant more to me than any medal. Because in that moment, I understood something my father never had. Blood doesn't have to salute you. Honor will. 3 days into our honeymoon, the ocean breeze in Maine smelled of salt and pine. Matthew had found a small coastal inn, the kind with creaky floors, mismatched chairs in the dining room, and blueberry pancakes made by a retired lobsterman named Roy. It was the first time in years I'd let my phone sit untouched for more than a day. That morning, Matthew set a cup of coffee in front of me and slid my phone across the table. "You should see this," he said quietly. It was a text from my cousin Clara, no words, just a single photo. The image was grainy, taken from across the street outside the Naval Chapel, but I knew the posture instantly, rigid, back straight, hands folded behind him. Colonel Raymond Keene, my father. He was standing in the parking lot, watching. I stared at the picture longer than I expected, my thumb hovering over the screen as if I could make sense of it by touch. Then Clara's second photo came through, the same frame, but he was turned away, mid-step, leaving. He'd come all the way there, and never walked inside. My first reaction was anger, not the hot kind, the cold, hollow kind that moves slow and settles deep. Then came the ache, that quiet voice that still remembered being a little girl polishing his medals, thinking one day she'd earn one of her own. And under it all, clarity. He'd chosen distance over redemption. Matthew sat across from me, patient as always, letting me take the time I needed. Finally, I handed him the phone. He studied the image, then looked up. "He came," he said, but he still couldn't stand. I didn't answer. I just sipped my coffee and listened to the waves outside the window. We spent the rest of the honeymoon in that quiet rhythm. Long walks along the shore, slow dinners, no talk about the photos. But they were there, in the back of my mind, like a shadow that never quite leaves a room. A few weeks later, I received an invitation from the Pentagon, a closed-door leadership forum on ethical command, asking me to give the keynote. Not because I was the first woman in my position, that kind of tokenism never interested me, but because of the training reforms I'd implemented that had saved lives without making headlines. At first, I considered declining. The thought of standing in front of a room full of brass and politicians wasn't exactly how I wanted to spend my post-wedding calm. But then I thought of the young instructor who'd taken his own life years before, the note he left tucked inside his file. "Tell Admiral Keene thank you. She's the only one who ever saw me." So I said yes. The night of the speech, the ballroom was full of decorated officers, polished nameplates, and conversations sharpened to points. I spoke about courage, not the kind that earns medals, but the kind that walks into a room and listens. I told them leadership wasn't about volume, but about presence. Authority, I said, isn't being the loudest in the chaos. It's being the calm everyone else can lean on. The standing ovation was loud, but it wasn't what stayed with me. What stayed was the letter that arrived 2 days later. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. I didn't enter the chapel because I didn't know how to sit among people who saw in you what I refused to. I didn't salute, not because you didn't earn it, but because I no longer knew how to honor what I didn't understand. I was wrong. If you'll let me, I'd like to talk. No uniform, no protocol. Just a father trying to understand a daughter he never took the time to know. I read it 3 times. Didn't cry, didn't burn it. Just sat with it. The way you sit with something fragile you're not sure you can trust but can't bring yourself to throw away. When Matthew came home that night, I handed him the letter. He read it in silence, then asked, "Do you want to meet him?" "I don't know," I said. "I don't owe him anything." "No," he said gently, "but maybe you owe yourself the choice." We met at Arlington. It was early morning, the air still holding that crispness before the sun decides to burn it off. The rows of white headstones stretched out in every direction, perfect and sobering. I arrived in uniform, not to prove anything, not as a challenge, but because it's who I am. He was already there, standing at my mother's grave. No bars on his shoulders, no medals pinned to his chest. Just a plain jacket, pressed slacks, and a man smaller than the giant who had towered over my childhood. He didn't move toward me, didn't reach for a hug. Instead, he looked at me the way you look at someone you haven't seen clearly in decades. Then quietly he said, "You look like your mother when you stand like that." We talked, not about medals, not about deployments, not about the years of silence. We talked about her, about how she used to hum when she graded papers, about the way she never let either of us leave the house angry. He admitted he thought silence was strength, but now he saw it for what it was, fear dressed up as discipline. Time passed in the way it does at Arlington, slow, measured, respectful. When it was time to part, he took a step back. His posture shifted, shoulders squared, chin lifted, and then, in a deliberate, unhurried motion, he raised his hand in salute. It wasn't crisp, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. I returned it, not because the past was suddenly forgiven, but because, for the first time, he had chosen truth over pride. That night, lying beside Matthew, I whispered, "He saluted." Matthew didn't ask what it meant. He just took my hand, and we fell asleep to the sound of rain against the roof. 6 months later, the Navy called. They wanted me to oversee a new Joint Operations Initiative, a program to integrate ethical leadership into cross-branch training. It was the kind of work I'd once dreamed of, and now it felt like legacy in motion. The job took me back to bases I hadn't set foot on in years. In one hangar, I saw a name on the roster that made me stop, Corporal Avery Patterson, the daughter of the man I'd dragged out of Somalia. She told me she joined because her father said I had saved his life. Sometimes the ripples of what you do don't circle back for decades, and when they do, they salute you in ways you never expect. Months later, I was asked to give the keynote at a major ROTC event. I decided to name the program I'd built the Salute Standard, not for what's worn, but for what's earned. Before the event began, I felt a presence behind me. My father. He'd come without fanfare, sat in the back row. He didn't speak during the speech, didn't try to insert himself, but when it ended, as I shook hands with cadets and instructors, he stepped forward. He removed his cap, extended his hand, and said, "I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry it took me so long." I nodded, not because it fixed everything, but because it started something. 1 year to the day after my wedding, I stood on a stage receiving the Department of Defense's Excellence in Ethical Command Award. In the front row, Matthew was smiling, and in the far corner my father stood, hand raised in a salute that this time was steady, certain. Later that night, one of my old SEALs texted me, "Still thinking about your wedding day, ma'am. Never seen that many warriors cry during a ceremony." That was the day we realized something. Blood doesn't salute, but we did. I showed the message to Matthew. He asked if I was going to respond. I typed back, "Some salutes stay with you forever." Because revenge isn't always about breaking what broke you. Sometimes it's about building what they never believed you could, and then standing tall enough that they have to look up to see you.